Greetings, friends. This is section 3 of Theological Ethics. We're going to be looking at virtue ethics, a case study, and some ethical options. Now, at the beginning of our talk, I think it would be important to define what we mean by virtue ethics. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says this: virtue ethics is currently one of three major approaches in normative ethics. It may initially be identified as the one that emphasizes virtues or moral character. It is distinct from other ethical theories, and we looked at a number of those last time, and I think it would be good to review. Now, first we looked at consequentialism, the moral philosophy that can be best captured by the saying, the end justifies the means. As example of a consequentialism system is the system of ethics called utilitarianism. All right. In that system, the most desirable, morally desirable situation is that in which people are happy. Their happiness is maximized. As we noted last time, this can lead to some nasty consequences for those people who are not in power. Then there was deontology, the ethical system in which morality is determined by duties or laws. One example is Kantian ethics. In that system, the only actions that are moral are those performed out of one's duty to follow the moral law, as opposed to acts performed out of desires. And we looked at three different aspects of Kantian ethics. So the simple example of deontological ethics either could be seen in requirements, duties, and for Christians, an example of that is following the Ten Commandments. Finally, we look at virtue ethics, in which the quality of character is the determiner of morality. The most famous incarnation is Aristotelian ethics, in which the highest moral good is the possession of certain moral character traits. However, one is supposed to have these traits in moderation. In Aristotle's book, the Nicomachean Ethic, 350 BC, he states that moderation is the key to morality. The idea of moderation, or the middle ground, was picked up by the Stoics. It simply states that a virtuous person is a balanced person. All right, let's continue. Now, there are three concepts that we need to learn when we're dealing with virtue ethics. They are virtue, practical wisdom, and eudaimonia. The virtue, such as honesty or kindness, is not just a tendency to do what is honest or kind. It is concerned with many perceptions, attitudes, interests, expectations, sensibilities. To possess a virtue is to be a certain type of person with a certain complex mindset. Therefore, one can see that it simply does not fit into this idea that virtue is on the basis of a single action. It's much more complex than that. This also means that principles such as men and women are created in the image of God. That's from Genesis 1:27, the idea of the Imago Dei. It means more than just the obvious idea that men and women are equal creations of God. It means that, but it means much more. It applies to a whole host of ethical ideas, from abortion to euthanasia, from daycare to social justice. The idea that people, men and women, have inherent worth and value, as God's creation is an example of the complexity of being an ethical person who makes ethical decisions. So we see the significance of virtue as the wholehearted acceptance of a certain range of considerations as reasons for actions. An honest person, again, a command with broad applications, cannot be identified simply through one action. or as one who, for example, practices honest dealings or does not cheat. If the actions are done merely because the agent thinks that honesty is the best policy, or merely out of fear of being caught rather than through recognizing to do otherwise would be dishonest as an applicable reason, they are not the actions of an honest person. In addition, it is not easy to balance mind, will, and emotions when we choose to do things. Looking at this idea from Aristotle, we can see that virtue ethicists draw a distinction between full or perfect virtue and continence. Yes, that continence. There's a real connection in that word. It also means strength of will. The fully virtuous do what they should do without a struggle against contrary desires, while the continent have to control their desires or temptations to do otherwise. The second part of virtue ethics is seen in practical wisdom, which philosophically is called phronesis. Phronesis is that ancient Greek word that represents prudence. As we say now, it's simply practical wisdom. Aristotle identified it as the distinctive characteristic of good political leaders and citizens in deciding the ethical and political issues that affected their lives. Practical wisdom allowed them to decide what was for the individual and corporate good. Realizing that good intentions are intentions to act well or do the right thing, one may say that practical wisdom is the knowledge or understanding that enables its owner to do what is right in any given situation. Many deontologists now stress the point that their action-guiding rules cannot reliably be applied correctly without practical wisdom, because correct application requires situational appreciation. Now, what do I mean? The capacity to recognize in any particular situation those features of it that are morally significant. It is interesting, in the book of Proverbs, it states that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom in Proverbs 9:10. Since the book of Proverbs is a book about the application of wisdom, one can readily see how this fits into the idea of phronesis, practical wisdom. Now, the last part of our discussion of virtue is seen in the concept of eudaimonia. This is a key term in ancient Greek moral philosophy. It is central to any of the Neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics, and usually employs even by virtue ethicists who deliberately separate themselves from Aristotle. It is often translated happiness, but that's not really accurate. It may be better described as flourishing or well-being. The idea of eudaimonia has been revived by the work of Alasdair MacIntyre in his book After Virtue, a study of moral theory, which relies on Augustine and Thomas Aquinas to support this idea of ethical well-being. Now, all these words that are used for eudaimonia have their disadvantages. The trouble with flourishing is that animals and even plants can flourish, but eudaimonia is possible only for rational beings. The trouble with happiness is that any modern understanding of that word is wildly subjective to the point of meaninglessness. Happiness is a personal idea. I am the only one who can tell you whether I am happy or not. But not the idea of flourishing or healthy. We have no difficulty in recognizing that I might think I am healthy, physically or psychologically, or think I am flourishing, and I can be just plain wrong. It seems obvious that flourishing is the better word to use rather than happiness. All usual versions of virtue ethics agree that living a life in accordance with virtue is necessary for eudaimonia. This supreme good is not conceived of as an independently defined state of life. Virtue ethicists claim that a human life devoted to physical pleasure or acquisition of wealth is not eudaimon. It is a wasted life. Eudaimonia knows nothing of the concept of the happy hedonist. Therefore, fans of James Bond should not be surprised to find out that he is not to be considered a virtuous man. Now, I hope this clears up some of the ideas surrounding virtue ethics. I did not want to take up too much time concerning Plato, Aristotle was Plato's student, or the Stoics, but I wanted to give you a quick overview of virtue ethics. Now, we need to take a look at our textbook. We're reading Hollinger's book, and on page 45 there's an interesting case study. Take a moment to read it. You can put this on pause. The story summary is that Stephen, a 53-year-old man, is on a business trip and he has sex with a woman who is not his wife. The question at the end of the case study is quite simply, did Stephen commit adultery? Is he an adulterer? But the deeper question that we need to ask, and the one we'll look at, is how do we judge this man morally? If you remember the utilitarian solution, we might answer with, no, he is not an adulterer. Stephen was away from his wife, and having sex with another woman could maximize his happiness. So, consistent consequentialists or utilitarianism or utilitarianists would argue that the consequences could easily be seen as acceptable. Now, if you've read your book, you probably noticed consequentialist comments about character ethics. If one has to look at the consequential position by defining a virtuous life as one who that defines the entire person, who he is, rather than what he did, again, Stephen winds up getting off the moral hook. For the deontologist, one might ask if there was a duty or a law that required Stephen to be faithful to his wife in marriage vows. In one sense, the answer is yes. There's a duty based upon community and cultural moral expectations. Therefore, Stephen would be judged as morally wrong. As we noted last time, without an unchanging moral foundation, deontology is little more than civic morality. In our own day, legal decisions have decided that foundational moral positions were no longer legally binding. For the deontologist, it becomes difficult to call Stephen an adulterer if he's not in violation of the law or the community standards. For deontology to function, as I stated last time, it must have an unchanging moral foundation. That is why for Christians, using the Bible and the principles, the unchanging principles in the Bible, that provides a moral foundation for deontology. Now, regarding virtue ethics, Stephen's actions are neither virtuous, display practical wisdom, or flourishing. Let's review. Stephen's actions do not seem virtuous, as in virtue, that complex moral idea that one's entire life is in moral balance. It lacks proper wisdom, or practical wisdom. There are many examples, but the first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs warn us, or warn men, to keep away from situations just like the one that Stephen got into. Finally, Stephen's actions were not eudaimonia, personal flourishing, but they were rather hedonistic. Now, no moral act is simple, and there are complex circumstances involved in every action. An example of this is the midwives who lied to Pharaoh in Exodus 1. Did they sin by saving the Israelite boys? Did they sin when they disobeyed Pharaoh and lied to him? These are not easy questions, and we all need wisdom to answer them. Therefore, as we go ahead, let's make sure that we all have the information necessary before we make moral judgments, and when we do make moral judgments, let us make sure to do so with great humility. This is Dr. Brent Kelly. Thank you very much. Until I see you next time, the Lord bless you.